Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES horizon and watched the stars change color as they dropped out of faster-than-light travel. The ship had been traveling for 6 months beyond the edge of human space, and Jake felt proud that humanity had finally reached this far into the galaxy. His crew of 200 brave souls had volunteered for this mission, knowing they might never return home, but they wanted to see what waited for them among the distant stars. Lisa Grant looked up from her science station with wide eyes as strange readings filled her screens. She had trained her whole life to study alien life, and now her instruments were picking up signals that could only come from intelligent beings. The patterns were too complex and organized to be natural phenomena, and Lisa felt her heart race as she realized they had found what humanity had been searching for since they first looked up at the night sky. Jake walked over to Lisa and placed a hand on her shoulder as they both stared at the data flowing across her monitors. Neither of them spoke for several minutes as the reality of their discovery settled in their minds. Humanity was not alone in the universe, and they were about to make contact with beings from another world. Jake took a deep breath and ordered his communications officer to prepare a first contact message using the universal mathematical principles that Earth scientists had developed for this exact moment, before the human ship could send their greeting. A massive vessel appeared in front of them as if it had materialized out of empty space. The alien ship was 10 times larger than the horizon, and its hull seemed to be made of some kind of crystal that reflected light in patterns that hurt human eyes to look at directly. Jake ordered his crew to battle stations even though he knew their weapons would be useless against such advanced technology. Abimas' voice filled the bridge, speaking perfect English in a tone that sounded both musical and cold at the same time. The being introduced itself as Ambassador Vexthara of the Zephyrian Collective and explained that they had been monitoring human radio signals for decades while deciding whether humans were ready for contact with galactic civilization. Jake felt both amazed and disturbed that these aliens had been watching Earth without making themselves known. Ambassador Vexthara appeared on their main screen as a tall crystalline figure that seemed to shift and change as it moved. The alien explained that the Zephyrian Collective was a confederation of over 300 different species that had joined together under their guidance and protection. Each species had been welcomed into the galaxy when they proved they were ready to abandon their primitive ways and accept the wisdom of more advanced civilizations. Lisa listened carefully as the ambassador described how the collective had brought peace and prosperity to countless worlds by ending the chaos and violence that younger species always seemed to create. Wars had been eliminated and suffering had been reduced to almost nothing under the careful management of the collective leadership. Every species that joined received advanced technology and the promise that they would never have to face the dangers of space alone. Dr. Ryan Blake had been quiet during the entire conversation, but now he stepped forward and asked the ambassador about the species that had refused to join the collective. Vexthara paused for a moment before explaining that, in their thousands of years of expansion, they had never encountered a species foolish enough to reject their offer of membership. Every intelligent race eventually recognized the benefits of accepting guidance from their superiors. Felt something cold settle in his stomach as he listened to the ambassador describe the process of integration that new species underwent. Their governments would be restructured under collective oversight, and their military forces would be disbanded, since protection would be provided by collective security forces. Cultural practices that were deemed harmful or inefficient would be gradually phased out and replaced with approved alternatives that promoted harmony and productivity. The ambassador went on to explain that humans showed promise despite their obvious primitive nature and violent tendencies. Earth would be given time to prepare for integration, and collective advisors would be sent to help human leaders understand what changes needed to be made. The process might take several generations, but eventually humanity would take its place as a junior member of galactic civilization. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what the ambassador was really offering. This was not an invitation to join an alliance of equals, but a demand for complete surrender of human independence. The collective was not interested in learning from humanity, but in reshaping them into something more acceptable to galactic standards. Ryan had been running calculations on his tablet, and now he looked up with concern written across his face. He had been analyzing the data about the 300-member species and noticed a disturbing pattern. None of them maintained their original governments or military forces, and all of them seemed to follow identical social and economic systems. It appeared that joining the collective meant giving up everything that made a species unique. Jake squared his shoulders and looked directly at the ambassador on the screen. He thanked Vexthara for the information about the collective, but explained that humanity would need time to consider such an important decision. The ambassador seemed surprised by this response, since most species were eager to accept their offer immediately, but agreed to give humans 1 Earth year to prepare for integration. As the alien ship disappeared into space, Jake turned to his crew and saw his own doubts reflected in their faces. They had dreamed of finding other intelligent life, but they had never imagined that first contact would come with such a heavy price. The question now was whether humanity would choose safety under alien rule or face the unknown dangers of independence among the stars. President Helen Davis stood before the assembled leaders of Earth as she prepared to deliver humanity's response to the Zephyrian Collective. The past year had been filled with heated debates in every government building and living room across the planet as humans struggled with the most important decision in their history. Some argued that accepting collective membership was the only way to ensure human survival, while others insisted that freedom was worth any risk. Helen had listened to thousands of hours of testimony from scientists, military leaders, philosophers, and ordinary citizens who all had strong opinions about what humanity should do. The collective had made their offer clear, and the deadline was approaching fast. Ambassador Vexthara had returned to Earth orbit twice during the year to answer questions, and each time the alien had seemed more puzzled by human hesitation to accept what they considered an obvious choice. Admiral Kevin Stone had spent the year working with military leaders from every nation to assess Earth's defensive capabilities against potential collective retaliation. The numbers were not encouraging, since human technology was centuries behind what the aliens possessed. Their ships could appear and disappear at will, while human vessels still relied on chemical rockets for basic transportation. Kevin knew that any military confrontation would be over before it began, but he also knew that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Dr. Amy Chun had been leading a team of the world's best engineers in studying the technology samples that the collective had provided as examples of what humanity could gain through membership. The alien devices were incredibly advanced, but Amy noticed something troubling about their design philosophy. Everything was built to follow predetermined patterns with no room for modification or creative adaptation. The technology was impressive, but it seemed to discourage the kind of innovative thinking that had always driven human progress. Amy had tried to reverse engineer some of the simpler devices and found that they would shut down completely if she attempted to alter their programming in any way. The collective technology was designed to prevent tampering or unauthorized changes, which meant that users had to accept whatever functions their alien creators had built into each device. This discovery had important implications for what membership in the collective would really mean for human technological development. Meanwhile, Ryan Blake had been analyzing the historical records that the collective had shared about their member species. Every civilization that joined the collective followed the same pattern of integration that eventually led to the complete replacement of their original culture and government systems. Species that had once been proud warriors became peaceful farmers, while advanced spacefaring civilizations were reduced to simple manufacturing centers that produced goods for other collective members. Ryan discovered that the collective was very efficient at identifying and eliminating what they called disruptive elements within new member species. Leaders who questioned collective policies were transferred to educational facilities, where they learned to appreciate the benefits of cooperation, while citizens who showed signs of rebellious thinking were assigned to work programs that kept them too busy to cause problems. The process was gradual and painless, but the result was always the same: complete transformation of the species into compliant collective members. The final decision had come down to a global referendum, where every human adult was allowed to vote on whether Earth should accept collective membership. The campaign had been intense, with both sides presenting passionate arguments about humanity's future. Supporters of membership emphasized the benefits of advanced technology and protection from galactic threats, while opponents focused on the loss of human freedom and independence that integration would require. Helen looked out at the cameras that would broadcast her announcement to the entire galaxy and took a deep breath before she began speaking. She thanked Ambassador Vexthara for the collective's generous offer and acknowledged the many benefits that membership would provide to humanity. She spoke about the difficult decision that Earth had faced and the careful consideration that human leaders had given to every aspect of the collective's proposal. Then Helen's voice grew stronger as she delivered the words that would change galactic history forever. She explained that humanity appreciated the collective's offer of guidance and protection, but had decided to chart their own course among the stars. Humans had always valued their freedom above their safety, and they were not willing to trade their independence for the promise of security under alien rule. Earth would face whatever challenges awaited them in space as a free and sovereign species. The reaction from Ambassador Vexthara was immediate and shocking. The alien's crystalline form seemed to flicker with what could only be described as disbelief as it processed humanity's response. In thousands of years of expansion, the collective had never encountered a species that rejected their offer of membership. Every intelligent race had eventually recognized the obvious benefits of joining galactic civilization rather than remaining isolated and vulnerable. Vexthara asked Helen to reconsider her decision and warned that independence would expose humanity to dangers that they could not possibly understand or defend against. The galaxy was full of hostile forces that would see Earth as an easy target without collective protection. Human technology was primitive, and their military forces were laughably weak compared to the threats that existed beyond their solar system. Helen listened politely to the ambassador's warnings, but her response remained unchanged. She acknowledged that independence would be dangerous and difficult, but explained that humans had faced impossible odds throughout their history and had always found ways to survive and thrive. Earth would take its chances as a free species rather than accept the comfortable slavery that collective membership represented. The ambassador's final words carried a tone that seemed almost sad as Vexthara explained that humanity's decision would have consequences that extended far beyond Earth. The collective's entire system depended on the principle that intelligent species would always choose security over chaos when given the choice. If word spread that humans had rejected membership, other species might begin to question their own status within the collective, and that could lead to instability across the galaxy. As the alien ship departed from Earth orbit, Kevin Stone began implementing the defense plans that his team had prepared for this moment. He knew that the collective would need to respond to humanity's defiance in some way to prevent other species from following their example. Earth had perhaps days or weeks before they faced the consequences of their choice, but Kevin was determined that humanity would meet whatever came next with courage and determination. Amy Chun returned to her laboratory to continue studying collective technology in search of weaknesses that human defenders could exploit. She had discovered that the aliens relied heavily on automated systems that followed rigid programming, and she hoped that human creativity might find ways to turn their advanced technology against them. The coming conflict would not be won by superior firepower, but by the kind of innovative thinking that had always been humanity's greatest strength. The Zephyrian Task Force dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the solar system with enough firepower to reduce Earth to cosmic dust within hours. Supreme Chancellor Kethmer had decided that humanity needed a demonstration of collective strength that would convince them to reconsider their foolish decision. The plan was simple and had worked countless times before with other stubborn species who initially resisted the obvious benefits of membership. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Parker watched the alien fleet approach on his command screens from the hidden military base on the far side of the moon. Earth's defenses consisted of converted civilian spacecraft, nuclear missiles designed for planetary warfare, and a handful of experimental weapons that had never been tested in actual combat. Steve knew that conventional military tactics would be useless against technology that was centuries ahead of anything humans possessed. The collective commander broadcast a message to Earth, demanding immediate surrender and promising that resistance would only result in unnecessary casualties. The alien voice carried the tone of a parent scolding a misbehaving child as it explained that this demonstration of force was for humanity's own good. Once humans saw the futility of opposing the collective, they would abandon their primitive notions of independence and accept the guidance they desperately needed. Steve had other plans, and he activated the first phase of what military strategists were calling the Chaos Protocol. Instead of meeting the alien fleet in open battle, human defenders would use guerrilla tactics that took advantage of their intimate knowledge of the solar system. The asteroid belt had been seeded with nuclear mines disguised as ordinary space rocks, while converted cargo ships waited in hidden positions throughout the outer planets. The first surprise came when the lead collective ships encountered what appeared to be a routine asteroid field. The aliens had scanned the area and detected nothing unusual, since human stealth technology was too primitive to register on their advanced sensors. They had not considered that humans might use such crude methods as physically hiding weapons inside actual asteroids that would explode when ships passed within range. Engineer Tony Clark had spent months preparing these unconventional weapons, using salvaged collective technology combined with human innovation. His team had discovered that alien devices could be modified if they were physically damaged in specific ways that bypassed their built-in security systems. The process destroyed most of the advanced functions but allowed humans to access basic power systems that could be used for their own purposes. Collective Fleet regrouped after losing several ships to the hidden mines and adjusted their approach to account for primitive booby traps. Their tactical computers quickly calculated new routes that would avoid potential ambush sites, while their advanced shields were configured to deflect any further crude attacks. The alien commanders felt confident that they had adapted to human desperation and would face no more surprises. They were wrong, because Dr. Kate Sullivan had been studying collective behavior patterns and identified their greatest weakness. The aliens approached every problem using established protocols that had worked successfully for thousands of years across hundreds of different species. They were incredibly efficient at solving known challenges, but they struggled when faced with situations that fell outside their experience. Database. The second wave of human attacks came from directions that the collective had deemed impossible. Based on their understanding of primitive species capabilities, converted civilian ships emerged from the upper atmosphere of Jupiter. where they had been hiding in the gas giant's radiation field. These vessels had been stripped of everything except engines and nuclear warheads, while their crews wore radiation suits that barely kept them alive long enough to complete their mission. Captain Ben Rogers led one of these suicide runs as his converted passenger liner accelerated toward a collective capital ship at maximum velocity. The aliens detected his approach, but their defensive systems were calibrated to stop sophisticated missiles and energy weapons not crewed spacecraft packed with nuclear explosives. Ben's ship was too slow and clumsy to be considered a serious threat until it was too late to stop. The ramming attack succeeded beyond human expectations as the massive alien vessel broke apart under the impact of the nuclear explosion. The collective had built their ships to withstand attacks from other advanced civilizations, not desperate humans who were willing to sacrifice everything for a single successful strike. Ben and his crew died in the explosion, but their sacrifice proved that even the most advanced alien technology had vulnerabilities. More converted ships emerged from hiding places throughout the solar system as human defenders continued their unconventional assault on the collective fleet. Mining vessels from the asteroid belt had been fitted with makeshift weapons, while orbital platforms around Mars launched swarms of modified satellites that the aliens initially dismissed as harmless debris. Tony Clark had programmed these satellites to emit electronic signals that interfered with collective communication systems in ways that the aliens had never encountered. Human radio technology was too primitive to register as a threat on their defensive screens, but it operated on frequencies that created unexpected harmonics with their advanced systems. The result was confusion and static that disrupted alien coordination just long enough for human attackers to exploit. The collective commander found himself facing a tactical situation that existed nowhere in their extensive military databases. Every established protocol for dealing with primitive species assumed that the defenders would use conventional weapons and strategies that could be easily countered with superior technology. The aliens had never fought an enemy that was desperate enough to use such crude and unpredictable methods. Kate Sullivan monitored the battle from Earth and provided real-time analysis of alien responses to human attacks. She had predicted that the collective would struggle to adapt their tactics. When faced with an opponent that refused to follow established patterns of behavior, each successful human strike forced the aliens to recalculate their approach, while Steve Parker prepared the next wave of surprises. The third phase of the chaos protocol involved weapons that the collective could not have imagined in their worst nightmares. Human scientists had spent decades studying theoretical physics that most advanced species had abandoned as too dangerous to pursue. Earth's defenders launched modified nuclear warheads that used experimental technology to create brief tears in space-time itself. These reality bombs exploded in ways that violated several fundamental laws of physics and created localized distortions that played havoc with collective navigation systems. The aliens found their ships suddenly facing directions that did not exist, while their computers struggled to process sensor data that made no logical sense. The weapons were as dangerous to humans as they were to the enemy, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The collective fleet began to retreat as their commander realized that this demonstration of force had become a genuine military disaster. They had expected to face primitive resistance that could be easily crushed, but instead found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to operate outside the normal rules of civilized warfare. The humans were not trying to win a conventional victory, but simply to prove that they could not be conquered without paying an unacceptable price. Steve Parker watched the alien ships withdraw beyond the outer planets and felt grim satisfaction at the first human victory in interstellar warfare. Earth had survived the initial test, but he knew that the collective would return with different tactics and overwhelming force. The element of surprise was now gone, and humanity would need to find new ways to defend their freedom against an enemy that commanded the resources of an entire galaxy. News of humanity's impossible victory against the collective fleet spread through the galaxy like wildfire despite every effort by alien authorities to suppress the information. On 1,000 worlds that had been peaceful members of galactic civilization for centuries, beings began whispering about the mad humans who had actually fought back against their superiors. The story grew more incredible with each retelling as species that had forgotten what rebellion meant tried to understand how such defiance was possible. Captain Ben Rogers had become a legend among the enslaved peoples of the galaxy, even though he had died in his attack on the collective capital ship. Underground networks that had existed in secret for generations suddenly found themselves sharing stories about the human pilot who had sacrificed his life rather than surrender his freedom. The name Ben Rogers was spoken in a dozen different languages by beings who had never heard of Earth but understood the meaning of his final act. Dr. Zara Mitchell had been working in deep cover on the industrial world of Thyros when word of the human resistance reached the slave factories where she pretended to be a simple technician. The planet's population consisted entirely of beings whose ancestors had been relocated there centuries ago to serve as workers for collective manufacturing facilities. They had been taught that rebellion was impossible and that their only hope for happiness lay in faithful service to their alien masters. Zara had been sent to Thyros months before the first human contact with the collective as part of a secret program to establish intelligence networks throughout alien space. Her mission had been to gather information about galactic civilization, but now she found herself in a position to do something far more important. The workers around her were hungry for hope, and the story of human defiance provided exactly what they needed to imagine a different future. The first resistance cell on Phalon, Thyros, formed around a group of Corvin miners who had been assigned to extract rare metals from the planet's core. These beings had once been proud warriors before their homeworld joined the collective, but generations of peaceful labor had supposedly bred the fight out of their people. Zara discovered that the warrior spirit still burned deep inside them when she began teaching them human concepts of guerrilla warfare and independent thinking. She started with simple ideas about questioning authority and thinking for themselves, rather than blindly following orders from their supervisors. The Corvins had been conditioned to accept that their alien overseers knew what was best for them, but Zara helped them remember that their ancestors had made their own decisions about how to live their lives. Small acts of defiance grew into larger ones as the workers began to realize that they outnumbered their guards by thousands to one. Meanwhile, on Earth, Captain Steve Parker was coordinating with resistance movements that were forming across the Pikavsteed galaxy through hidden communication networks that the collective had never suspected existed. The alien authorities controlled all official channels of information, but they had not anticipated that conquered species might develop secret ways of sharing news and organizing opposition to their rule. The breakthrough came when Dr. Kate Sullivan discovered that the collective's information suppression systems had a fundamental flaw that humans could exploit. The aliens monitored all communications for signs of seditious content, but their automated censorship programs were designed to detect threats from advanced civilizations, not the simple codes that human intelligence agents had developed for covert operations. Kate's team began broadcasting resistance instructions disguised as innocent commercial messages that passed through collective filters without triggering any security alerts. The information was hidden in mathematical patterns that looked like routine business data but contained detailed plans for sabotage operations and recruitment techniques. Species across the galaxy received these messages and began applying human tactics to their own local situations. The effect was immediate and dramatic as production Facilities throughout collective space began experiencing mysterious equipment failures and supply chain disruptions. The Tessari communication networks that connected distant star systems started suffering from technical problems that seemed to occur whenever important military information needed to be transmitted. Aquatic Netheloni workers who maintained underwater industrial complexes reported strange accidents that always seemed to happen at the worst possible times for their supervisors. Supreme Chancellor Kethmur watched reports of spreading unrest with growing alarm as he realized that the human problem was metastasizing beyond anything his advisors had predicted. The original plan had been to make an example of Earth that would discourage other species from following their lead, but instead the opposite had occurred. Human resistance had inspired conquered peoples to remember what they had lost when they accepted collective protection centuries ago. Emergency sessions of the Galactic Council produced increasingly desperate proposals for containing the rebellion before it could spread to the core worlds where the most important collective facilities were located. Some members suggested immediate nuclear bombardment of Earth to eliminate the source of the contagion, while others argued for massive propaganda campaigns that would convince member species that human ideas were dangerous delusions. Dr. Grace Foster had been working as a diplomatic liaison with newly contacted resistance groups when she received word that formal alliances were being proposed between Earth and several rebel organizations. The idea of an actual military partnership between humans and alien freedom fighters had seemed impossible just months earlier, but now representatives from a dozen species were requesting meetings to coordinate their liberation efforts. Grace found herself in the unprecedented position of negotiating humanity's first interstellar treaties with beings whose governments had been eliminated centuries ago, but who still maintained the cultural authority to speak for their peoples. The Corvin mining guilds could speak for millions of workers throughout the galaxy, while Tessari communication specialists had the ability to coordinate resistance activities across thousands of star systems. The most important alliance came with the Nethelani aquatic engineers, who controlled much of the collective's underwater infrastructure throughout the galaxy. These beings had been conquered so long ago that most other species had forgotten they had ever been independent, but their technical expertise made them invaluable partners in any campaign to disrupt alien military operations. They brought detailed knowledge of collective weaknesses that even human intelligence had not suspected. Tony Clark received technical specifications from Nethelani saboteurs that revealed critical vulnerabilities in the power systems that supported major collective installations. The aliens had built their infrastructure using standardized components that were incredibly efficient, but also created single points of failure that could be exploited by coordinated attacks. A small group of engineers with the right knowledge could potentially shut down entire star systems if they struck at the correct targets. The liberation movement gained momentum as success bred more success, and species that had been passive for generations began to remember what it felt like to control their own destinies. The collective's greatest strength had always been the voluntary cooperation of member species, who genuinely believed that alien rule was preferable to the chaos of independence. That belief was crumbling as more beings learned that freedom was not only possible, but worth fighting for regardless of the cost. Zara Mitchell watched Corvin miners on Theros openly defy their supervisors for the first time in living memory, as they demanded better working conditions and the right to organize their own labor unions. The alien overseers were completely unprepared to deal with such unprecedented behavior, and their attempts to restore order only created more resentment among workers who had finally remembered their own worth as sentient beings. The spark that humanity had lit was spreading faster than anyone had imagined possible, and the galaxy would never be the same. Supreme Chancellor Kethmer faced the collapse of everything his civilization had built over thousands of years, and he knew that only the complete elimination of human influence could prevent the total destruction of collective authority. The final war for galactic freedom was about to begin. Supreme Chancellor Kethmer stood before the assembled might of the collective military as he authorized the complete extermination of the human species and all beings who had been infected with their dangerous ideas about independence. The order represented the largest military mobilization in galactic history as ships from 1,000 worlds converged on Earth with enough firepower to crack planets and sterilize entire star systems. The human rebellion would end in total annihilation and the galaxy would return to its proper state of peaceful order. The massive armada that assembled at the edge of human space dwarfed anything that had ever been seen before as vessels carrying the most advanced weapons in collective arsenals prepared for the final assault on Earth. Admiral commanders from dozens of species coordinated their attack plans with mathematical precision while their automated targeting systems calculated the most efficient methods for eliminating every trace of human civilization from the galaxy. But something unprecedented was happening across collective space as the military prepared for its ultimate demonstration of power. On the mining world of Corvin Prime, the guilds that supplied rare metals essential for starship construction suddenly announced that their workers were too sick to continue operations. The illness was mysterious and seemed to affect only those beings involved in military production, while civilian manufacturing continued without interruption. Colonel Matt Turner monitored these developments from his hidden base on Europa as reports flooded in from resistance cells throughout the galaxy. The coordination was remarkable as species that had been separated by vast distances and cultural differences worked together to implement what human strategists had named the Liberation Protocol. Every action was timed to achieve maximum disruption of collective military operations at the exact moment when Earth faced its greatest danger. The Tessari communication networks that connected the collective military command structure began experiencing cascading failures that seemed to spread like a virus through their quantum relay systems. Dr. Kate Sullivan had worked with Tessari resistance engineers to develop software patches that appeared to fix routine maintenance problems but actually created hidden vulnerabilities that could be triggered by specific signal patterns broadcast from Earth. Grace Foster watched from the diplomatic center in Geneva as alien ambassadors who had served the collective faithfully for centuries suddenly found themselves unable to contact their home governments or receive orders from their military commanders. The communication breakdowns were selective and surgical, affecting only systems related to the war effort while leaving civilian networks untouched. The message was clear that this was not random technical failure, but coordinated sabotage. On the aquatic world of Nethelani, the underwater cities that housed major collective shipyards reported massive flooding in their construction facilities as ancient seals and pressure barriers suffered simultaneous structural failures. The Nethelani engineers who maintained these systems explained to their supervisors that the problems were caused by metal fatigue and poor design decisions made centuries ago, but Dr. Zara Mitchell knew the truth was far more deliberate. The shipyard disasters crippled production of new vessels just when the collective needed every available ship for their assault on Earth. Hundreds of partially completed warships were destroyed by the artificial floods, while the specialized equipment needed to build advanced weapon systems was damaged beyond repair. The timing could not have been coincidental, as every major military facility in Nethelani space suffered similar accidents within hours of each other. Tony Clark had been working with resistance engineers throughout the galaxy to identify the most critical components of collective infrastructure, and the results of their planning were now visible as supply chains collapsed across multiple star systems. Food distribution networks failed on worlds that depended on imported sustenance, while power grids shut down on planets that hosted major military installations. The collective had built an incredibly efficient system, but efficiency meant that small disruptions could have massive consequences. The alien military commanders found themselves fighting a war on 1,000 fronts as their own member species turned against them in ways that violated every principle of galactic civilization. Species that had been loyal citizens for generations were now actively sabotaging the very systems that maintained their comfortable lives under collective protection. The rebellion had evolved beyond human influence into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. Supreme Chancellor Kethmar received reports that his own Zephyrian homeworld was experiencing civil unrest as younger generations questioned why their government was spending enormous resources to destroy a species that had never threatened them directly. The protesters argued that humanity had simply chosen independence over membership and that this decision should be respected rather than punished with genocide. Such thoughts had been unthinkable just months earlier, but now they were spreading through Zephyrian society like a plague. Dr. Noah Black had been developing the technical specifications for what resistance leaders called the Great Liberation, a coordinated strike against collective control centers that would free dozens of enslaved species simultaneously. The plan required precise timing and incredible courage from beings who risked everything for the chance to reclaim their freedom. Noah knew that failure would result in the complete destruction of every species involved, but success could transform the entire galaxy. The Liberation Protocol entered its final phase as resistance cells received their activation orders through hidden communication networks that the collective had never detected. On mining worlds throughout the galaxy, Corvin workers abandoned their posts and marched on administrative centers demanding the immediate withdrawal of alien occupation forces. Their supervisors called for military assistance, but found that their communication systems had mysteriously failed. Tazari technicians who maintained the quantum relay networks that connected distant star systems began implementing what they called emergency maintenance procedures that would temporarily shut down interstellar communications. The maintenance was scheduled to last exactly as long as the liberation assault would require to succeed, ensuring that collective forces could not coordinate their response to the unprecedented rebellion. Nethaloni saboteurs triggered the destruction of underwater facilities that supported collective military operations throughout aquatic regions of the galaxy. The attacks were surgical and precise, eliminating only those installations that served military purposes while leaving civilian infrastructure untouched. The message was clear that this was liberation, not conquest, and that the rebels sought freedom rather than revenge. Grace Foster coordinated the diplomatic aspects of the liberation as newly freed species announced their withdrawal from collective membership and their intention to form independent governments. The declarations of independence arrived simultaneously from dozens of worlds, creating a legal and political crisis that threatened the very foundations of galactic civilization. The collective had never faced mass defection on such a scale, and their legal systems had no procedures for dealing with this unprecedented situation. The timing of the Great Liberation was perfect, as the collective military found itself unable to respond effectively to the coordinated rebellion while also preparing for their final assault on Earth. Communication failures prevented proper coordination between distant fleets, while supply shortages left many ships without the resources needed for extended operations. The rebellion had successfully paralyzed the largest military force in galactic history at the moment when it was most needed. Matt Turner watched the reports flow in from across the galaxy and felt amazement at what had been accomplished through the courage and sacrifice of countless beings who had chosen freedom over safety. The Liberation Protocol had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes as species that had been enslaved for centuries reclaimed their independence and dignity. The galaxy was awakening from its long sleep of enforced peace and remembering what it meant to be truly alive. But the war was far from over as Supreme Chancellor Kethmer ordered his remaining forces to proceed with the attack on Earth regardless of the chaos spreading throughout collective space. The humans had started this rebellion and they're complete. Elimination remained the only way to restore order to the galaxy. The final battle would determine whether freedom or tyranny would shape the future of galactic civilization. The final battle for the future of galactic civilization began when the remaining collective fleet emerged from hyperspace around Earth with weapons charged and targeting systems locked onto every human population center. Supreme Chancellor Kethmer had decided that even if his empire was crumbling throughout the galaxy, the complete destruction of humanity would serve as a warning to any other species that might consider rebellion. The humans would die and their memory would be used to terrify future generations into submission. Admiral Rachel Stone stood on the bridge of the hastily converted battleship UES Defiance as she coordinated Earth's defense against impossible odds. The human fleet consisted of military vessels, converted civilian ships, and captured alien technology that had been jury-rigged by engineers, who understood that creativity was their only advantage against superior firepower. Rachel knew that traditional naval tactics would be useless, but she also knew that humans had never been traditional in their approach to warfare. The first phase of the battle saw human defenders implementing lessons learned from their earlier victory as modified asteroids packed with nuclear warheads were launched at the approaching collective fleet. The aliens had adapted their defenses to counter such crude attacks, but they had not anticipated the scale and coordination of the human assault. Hundreds of improvised weapons struck their ships simultaneously as Earth's entire asteroid belt was converted into a massive minefield. Captain Luke Thompson led a squadron of converted cargo vessels in a desperate flanking maneuver designed to exploit gaps in the alien formation. His ships had been stripped of everything except engines and weapons while their crews wore jury-rigged spacesuits that barely provided life support for the duration of their mission. Luke had volunteered for what everyone knew was a suicide run, but his sacrifice would buy precious time for the main human force to organize their defense. But as the battle raged around Earth, something extraordinary was happening throughout the galaxy as news of humanity's final stand spread through the networks that the Great Liberation had established. Species that had just reclaimed their freedom refused to abandon the beings who had inspired their rebellion and began launching their own attacks against remaining collective forces. The war was no longer about Earth's survival, but about the future of freedom itself. The Corvin mining guilds had captured their homeworlds, orbital defenses, and now turned those weapons against the collective garrison that had ruled their people for centuries. Corvin warriors who had been reduced to industrial laborers remembered their ancestors' fighting spirit as they stormed alien command centers and liberated their enslaved kinsmen. The proud warrior culture that the collective had tried to erase forever burned bright once again. Dr. Sam Brooks monitored communication networks from his position aboard the command ship as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. The rebellion was spreading faster than anyone had imagined possible as species that had never known anything but collective rule discovered what it meant to fight for their own destiny. The mathematical precision of the alien empire was collapsing under the chaotic creativity of beings who refused to accept predetermined limits on their potential. Engineer Julia Adams had been working frantically to complete the most ambitious project in human history as she prepared to broadcast a galaxy-wide message that would become known as the Declaration of Galactic Independence. The transmission would use every communication network that resistance fighters had captured to reach every inhabited world simultaneously. Julia knew that the message would inspire further rebellion, but it would also make humanity a permanent target for any surviving collective forces. The declaration began with words that had echoed through human history for centuries as it proclaimed that all sentient beings were created equal and possessed certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the document went further than any human declaration had gone before, as it specifically addressed the situation of species that had been conquered and absorbed by galactic empires. No being had the right to rule over another without consent, and any government that denied basic freedoms had lost its legitimacy. Supreme Chancellor Kethmer watched his empire disintegrate as the human transmission spread through captured networks and inspired new waves of rebellion on worlds that had been peaceful for millennia. The collective's entire philosophy was based on the idea that advanced species had the right and responsibility to guide primitive ones toward enlightenment, but the humans had proven that enlightenment could not be imposed from above. True wisdom came from within and could only flourish when beings were free to make their own choices. The tide of battle around Earth turned when reinforcements began arriving from liberated worlds throughout the galaxy. Corvan warships built in captured shipyards joined the fight alongside Tessari vessels that had been modified with human weapons technology. Nethalani submarines emerged from Jupiter's subsurface ocean to attack collective ships that had taken refuge in the gas giant's atmosphere. The solar system became the focal point for a galactic war between freedom and tyranny. Dr. Kate Sullivan had been analyzing collective behavior patterns throughout the conflict, and she made a discovery that changed everything about humanity's strategy for victory. The aliens were not evil in any traditional sense, but were instead the victims of their own success, as they had created a system so efficient that it had eliminated the very qualities that made civilization worth preserving. Their technology was perfect, but sterile, while their society was peaceful but lifeless. The final breakthrough came when resistance forces captured the collective central command facility on the heavily fortified world of Zephyr Prime. The installation contained the master control systems that coordinated the activities of hundreds of member species across the galaxy, and its capture would effectively end centralized alien authority forever. The assault was led by a joint force of humans and newly liberated aliens who fought side by side as equals rather than masters and servants. Captain Steve Parker had survived the war's early battles and now found himself leading the final assault on the command center that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years. The facility was defended by automated systems that had never failed in all of collective history, but they had been designed to stop conventional attacks, not the chaotic improvisation that human tactics represented. Steve's forces used demolition charges and jury-rigged weapons to blast through defenses that had withstood siege by entire fleets. The moment of victory came not with massive explosions or dramatic combat, but with a simple transmission that originated from the captured command center as resistance forces broadcast shutdown codes to collective installations throughout the galaxy. The alien empire had been so centralized that destroying its nerve center paralyzed the entire system within hours. Automated defenses powered down while administrative computers stopped responding to input from their bewildered operators. Admiral Rachel Stone stood on her bridge and watched the surviving collective ships retreat beyond the edge of human space as their commanders realized that their empire no longer existed. The aliens had not been defeated in the traditional military sense, but had instead been made irrelevant as their member species chose independence over the security that collective membership had provided. The war was over, but the real work of building a free galaxy was just beginning. Supreme Chancellor Kethmer found himself a leader without followers, as even his own Zephyrian people chose to abandon the collective and establish their own democratic government. He had spent his entire life believing that order was more important than freedom, but the humans had proven that beings could create their own order without sacrificing their dignity. The galaxy would face chaos and uncertainty, but it would also experience growth and innovation that had been impossible under alien rule. The formation of the Galactic Free Alliance marked the beginning of a new era in interstellar relations as species that had been enemies or strangers learned to cooperate as equals. The alliance was based on voluntary participation and mutual benefit rather than the imposed hierarchy that had characterized the collective. Members retained their sovereignty while working together to address common challenges like exploration, trade, and defense against external threats. Luke Thompson survived his suicide mission and found himself promoted to Admiral of the first truly integrated human-alien fleet in galactic history. The ships under his command represented dozens of different species and technologies, but they were united by a common commitment to protecting the freedom that so many beings had died to achieve. The fleet would explore unknown regions of space and establish contact with species that had never known the collective's influence. As the smoke cleared from the greatest war in galactic history, humanity began to understand what they had accomplished through their stubborn refusal to accept limits imposed by others. They had not conquered the galaxy through superior force, but had instead liberated it by demonstrating that the spirit of freedom was contagious among all sentient beings.